Confidential. Attention is called to the penalties attaching to any infraction of the Official Secrets Acts. Confidential Book 4051 40 U-93 Interrogation of Survivors, April 1942, Naval Intelligence Division, Admiralty. The following report is compiled from information derived from prisoners of war. The statements made cannot always be verified. They should therefore not be accepted as facts unless they are definitely stated to be confirmed by information from other sources. Table of Contents. Section 1, Introductory Remarks. Section 2, Crew of U-93. Section 3, Early History of U-93. 4, Earlier Cruises of U-93. 5, Last Cruise of U-93. 6, Sinking of U-93. 7, U-Boat Losses. 8, U-Boats of the 7th U-Boat Flotilla. 9, Other U-Boats. 10, U-Boat Bases. 11, U-Boat Construction. 12, Victualling in U-Boats. 13, Action between Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and H.M.S. Glorious on 8th June 1940. 14, German Political Training Establishments. 15, Passage of U-Boats north of Iceland. Plate, Plan of Blohm and Voss Yard, Hamburg. Appendix, List of crew of U-93. Report on interrogation of survivors from U-93, a 500-ton U-boat sunk at 01:15 on 15th July 1942 in position 36 degrees by 40 north and 15 degrees by 52 west. Section 1, Introductory Remarks. Of the 40 survivors from U-93, the engineer officer and 3 ratings arrived in the United Kingdom on 2nd February 1942. The remainder did not reach this country until 7th March, 7 weeks after capture. The usual difficulties due to the crew having been together for so long, enabling them to fabricate false stories, were encountered. The customary lectures on what to expect under interrogation had been given to them. In addition to this, U-boat crews seem to have been instructed to complain as much as possible in order to make themselves a nuisance. Since no prisoner of war can be punished for making a complaint, even if the complaint is unreasonable, the earliest opportunity is taken to exploit the Geneva Convention in this respect. The attitude of several prisoners recently captured has been insolent in the extreme, and when removed for later interrogation, the opportunity has been taken to complain of ill treatment. Section 2, Crew of 93. The complement of U-93 at the time of her sinking consisted of 46 officers and men, of whom 40 were saved. Her commanding officer was Oberleutnant zur Horst Elfe. This was his second cruise in command of this boat. Aged 24, Elfe was born on 23rd April 1917 in Berlin, where his father was a high official on the Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft, General Electric Company. He joined the German Navy in 1936 and was promoted to lieutenant on 1st October 1938. He had been in the U-boat service before the outbreak of war and made 7 cruises with Corvette Capitaine, or Commander Kretschmer, on U-99, where Elfe had been second officer of the watch. He left U-99 on 12th December 1940 and probably went through a commanding officer's course on shore. He was appointed to U-93 in October 1941. He seemed to be a good type of German officer, of rather higher social standing than the majority. Before joining the Navy, he had been an active member of the Hitler Youth movement, in which he attained the rank of corporal. His training in the movement had included an infantry course and instruction in sailing on the Wannsee Lakes near Berlin. He said that this was his second visit to England, for before the war he had spent some 3 months, one summer with friends near Bath and in Oxford. His crew did not seem to have a very high regard for his skill as a commanding officer, and some of them held him responsible for the loss of his ship. However, it would not have been imagined from Elfe's bearing that he viewed himself in this light. In conversation he was extremely security-conscious, and had constantly enjoined the same behavior on his crew. The first lieutenant was Lieutenant Zersee Hans Opitz, a distant cousin of Captain Lieutenant Herbert Opitz, commanding officer of U-206, aged 24 on 20th March 1942. This officer had entered the Navy in 1937 and joined the U-boat service while still a midshipman. He had not made a war cruise, however, until his promotion to sub-lieutenant. At the time of the Norwegian campaign, he said he was in a cruiser operating in the far north, where he had been in action against British aircraft, but no attacks have been made on British shipping. Before the war, he had made a cruise overseas in the training ship Schleswig-Holstein, and had done some of his training in the sailing ship Albert Leo Schlagita. Opitz was born on 20th March 1918 in Orienburg, near Berlin, and said that he had been shown around the notorious concentration camp there as a boy by a friend, who was one of the guards. His father is a government official in Berlin. Though a fairly pleasant and polite character, Opitz was also extremely security conscious. Lieutenant Engineer Erich Becker was the engineer officer of U-93. Aged 28, he was the oldest officer on board. He was born in Ettlingen, Baden, on 21st August 1913. He was an engineer by profession. This officer aroused a great deal of attention by reason of his being the first known Ordensjunker to be captured. This is the title given to those who have attended training courses at Ordensbergen, German political training establishments, described later in this report. Becker had attended the Ordensberg course near Stettin for a short while, but his training had been interrupted by the war. He seemed of a somewhat dreamy nature, at the same time strongly Nazi. Some sheets of verse were taken from him on arrival and proved to be poems of his own composition. As was the case with his brother officers, he proved strongly security conscious. Of the 3 midshipmen carried, only 2 survived. Fenrik Zersee Hans Joachim Steifensand, aged 20, was born in Berlin 19th January 1922, and was the son of a landowner in Pomerania. Fenrik Zersee Peter Fischer, aged 18, was born in Bobingen, near Augsburg, on 11th September 1923. He entered the Navy on 1940 and, after 9 months of further training, was appointed to a mine-sweeping flotilla at Wilhelmshaven. Following further general training in seamanship, he was sent to sea in U-93. Both midshipmen were to receive their training at the U-boat school after one cruise on a U-boat. The lost midshipman was Oberfenrik Zersee Liebe, whom his comrades described as being the younger brother of the celebrated Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Liebe, now in command of U-332. When Elfe took over command of U-93 in October 1941, the engineering officer and 14 of the crew joined at the same time. This fact was admitted and unfavorably commented on by one of the officers. 10 new ratings were taken on board just before the last cruise began in December, and 10 more of the crew were to be changed before the next cruise. Of the quality of the men, the officers had little complaint, but they criticized the frequent changes in the crew. The morale on board appears to have been of a high standard, and the captain was on the whole popular with his crew, despite their contention that he was responsible for the loss of his boat. This may have been due to some extent to the fact that he kept them well supplied with beer, and brought them each a small present at Christmas time. A former Oberstürmmann, or chief quartermaster first class, who was aboard U-93 on one of her earlier cruises, was reputed to have made as many as 15 war cruises. His merit was recognized, and he was disembarked for a commanding officer's course and afterwards appointed to a small U-boat of his own. One of the telegraphist ratings, Peter Thyssen, claimed to be a great-nephew of Fritz Thyssen, the industrial magnate. Section 3. Early History of U-93. U-93 was a 500-ton boat type 7C of the series U-93 to U-98, built at the Germania Yard Kiel, and laid down before the outbreak of war. She was not completed until July 1940, more than a month later than the boats of the series U-99 to U-102, also built by the Germania Yard at Kiel. But this later series, U-99 to U-102, are all Type 7B, and doubtless U-93 was in some respects an improvement on this type, but the exact differences have not yet been ascertained. U-93 was similar in every respect to U-570, now H.M.S. Graf. She was commissioned on 30th July 1940. Kapitänleutnant Klaus Korth was the first commanding officer of U-93. He had formerly commanded U-57, a 250-ton U-boat. Section 4. Earlier cruises of U-93. It has been difficult to obtain reliable information regarding the earlier cruises of U-93, since only 2 members of the crew had served in her since she was commissioned in July 1940. One of these is an engine room petty officer who refused to give any information whatsoever, and the other an engine room rating who was willing to say what he knew, but whose memory was frequently at fault. No documents were recovered to substantiate any of the statements made. First cruise. U-93's first cruise consisted of her trip from the Baltic after completion of her trials to join 7th U-Boat Flotilla, which was to be based on St. Nazaire. Her officers at this time were Kapitänleutnant Klaus Korth in command, Oberleutnant zur See Freiherr von Tiesenhausen, First Lieutenant, Lieutenant zur See Gretschel, and Lieutenant Engineer Sub-Lieutenant Klassen. Korth was married at Kiel on 25th December 1940, and U-93 sailed from that port 10 days later at 1000 German summer time on 5th October 1940. From Kiel, U-93 proceeded to Kristiansand, where she spent some hours of darkness, leaving early the following morning for the region of Bergen, whither she was escorted by a patrol vessel. In the latitude of Bergen, the patrol boat parted company, and U-93 continued her journey alone. There is no evidence that she actually touched at this port. When in the neighborhood of the Scottish coast, U-93 sighted a convoy described by one of the crew as consisting of 60 to 80 ships. Whilst on the surface in the vicinity of the convoy, U-93 fired all 5 torpedoes, but none of them found their mark. Korth then became extremely angry, gave the order to submerge, only to find his boat subjected to a heavy depth charge attack, which the engine room rating described as being extremely uncomfortable. N.I.D. note: Leith, escorting OB-228, sighted a U-boat trimmed down in the vicinity of the convoy on the night of 15th-16th October. 3 depth charge attacks were made. At dawn the following day, U-93 surfaced and launched another attack. 2 torpedoes were fired, and according to statements made by the only 2 prisoners who took part in the cruise, one of these hit an 8,000-ton tanker, and the second, missing the target at which it had been aimed, nevertheless struck a 6,000-ton freighter from the same convoy. It seems probable that these 2 ships were the British motor vessel British Glory, 6,993 tons, and the Bonheur, 5,327 tons, in convoy OB-228, which were attacked between 0400 and 0500 on 15th October 1940 in position 57 degrees by 10 north and 8 degrees by 36 west. The British Glory did not sink. N.I.D. note: It will be noted that this account reverses these events, stating that the depth charge attacks occurred on the first night. Attempts to link up these incidents must therefore be treated with reserve. No further events were said to have taken place on this cruise, which lasted for 3 weeks, U-93 arriving at her French base about 25th October 1940. Some doubt exists as to whether the base entered on this occasion was Lorient or St. Nazaire. One rating who had taken part in this cruise was convinced that it was St. Nazaire, since he claimed to remember that his boat was the second U-boat to enter the port. He added that the manager of the local Hôtel de Messagerie had told him that the first U-boat to enter this harbor had left a few days earlier. Second cruise. U-93 is believed to have sailed on her second war cruise from St. Nazaire or Lorient between 15th and 20th November 1940. This appears to have been singularly uneventful for a commanding officer with a reputation such as Korth enjoyed. No sinkings were claimed. The cruise is stated to have lasted for about 4 weeks. The officers were the same as on the first cruise. Christmas Eve was given as the date of her return. Korth was certainly on shore that day, since he signed a letter of greetings to a prisoner of war in England, dated 24th December 1940. Third cruise. It has been possible to obtain more reliable information regarding the third cruise of U-93, for the statements made by the engine room rating agree very much with the details taken from an account published in the Kieler Neueste Nachrichten of 6th March 1941. Although the number of the U-boat was not given, there can be no doubt that it was U-93 under Captain Lieutenant Korth. U-93 left Lorient on January 1941. Her officers on this cruise were Korth, in command, Oberleutnant Götz von Hartmann, who had relieved Freiherr von Tissenhausen as first lieutenant, Stabsoberstürmann Quartermaster First Class Barber, who had relieved Sub-Lieutenant Gretschel, and Lieutenant Engineer Klassen, who remained as engineer officer. U-93 operated in the North Atlantic. The cruise was an eventful one, the tonnage sunk being claimed as 24,000 tons. The outstanding event was the persistent and spirited attack on U-93 made by Whitley aircraft T of 502 Squadron at 1647 on 10th February 1941 in position 56 degrees by 30 north and 14 degrees by 38 west. This attack was described by the engine room rating of U-93 and figures also in the description of the cruise as published in the German press. Details of this attack are given in a later paragraph. During the early hours of 29th January 1941, U-93 took part in the attacks on convoy SC-19 in about 56 degrees north and 15 degrees by 21 west, out of which convoy 6 ships were sunk. U-93 claimed 3 of these. The first was described as a 6,000-ton freighter sunk by the first torpedo fired by U-93. This was probably the SS King Robert, 5,886 tons, sunk at 0250 on 29th January 1941 in approximately 56 degrees north and 15 degrees by 20 west. The second ship was described as a 10,000-ton freighter, which was also sunk by torpedo at close range. This appears to have been the British motor tanker W.B. Walker, 10,468 tons, sunk at 0258 on 29th January. U-93 then proceeded to attack a third ship, described as a 6,000-ton vessel, which sighted the U-boat, turned to ram, and very nearly succeeded in doing so, for the German press, in describing the incident, said that by a hair's breadth the boat passed across the ship's bow at high speed and fired a torpedo at close range. This seems to have been the Greek SS Ekaterina, 4,929 tons, sunk at 0301 on 29th January 1941. A fourth ship was then attacked, also of approximately 6,000 tons, but before Korth was able to maneuver into position, an explosion occurred on the other side of the ship, and she broke in two and sank. This was probably the British SS Rushpool, 5,125 tons, sunk at 0527 on 29th January 1941 by another U-boat. N.I.D. note: this account agrees substantially with the analysis of the attack made on this convoy and appears to be correct. Some few days later, U-93 came up with a small steamer in ballast, sailing independently. Korth attacked her without success. He was about to surface in order to sink her by gunfire when he observed through the periscope a German bomber about to attack. Korth remarked, "What a pity, he hasn't hit her. Well, we don't always hit either." During the hours of daylight of 3rd February 1941, U-93 continued to stalk the unsuspecting vessel. At nightfall, Korth surfaced to attack with gunfire, but the gun jammed, and instead the British ship opened fire. Korth replied with machine gun fire until the heavier gun had been repaired. By the time this had been done, the moon had set and the visibility was poor. But the ship had no chance, and the crew abandoned ship. This was the British SS Dion II, 2,660 tons, hit by aircraft at 1545 on 3rd February 1941 in 55 degrees by 40 north and 14 degrees by 23 west, but not seriously damaged, and sunk by gunfire by a U-boat at 0315 on 4th February about 55 degrees by 52 north and 10 degrees 29 west. During the next 6 days, nothing was sighted until at noon on 10th February 1941, a British bomber appeared, and for some hours a spirited duel ensued. 4 times did the British aircraft return to the attack. During the first attack, U-93 immediately submerged. 2 bombs were dropped, which, according to the German account, exploded close to the U-boat, then only a few meters below the surface. Some damage was done. The boat was out of trim, but the defects were repaired. Court surfaced and the gun was manned. The aircraft returned to attack and machine-gunned the boat. A third attack was made, and Court had claimed that his fire had been effective and had put the aircraft's foremost gun out of action. According to the German account, the British plane flew off after the fourth attack, and, in the words of the commanding officer, U-93 limped home on one leg. The engine room rating, who also described this attack, said that U-93's starboard electric motor had been damaged by the effect of the bombs, and the automatic battery switch had been put out of action. N.I.D. note: this account agrees well with Whitley T-502's version of the attack. The U-boat was seen to break the surface stern first after the depth charge attack. White smoke was belching from the stern, and the U-boat remained in this condition for about 8 minutes. Meanwhile, the Whitley machine-gunned the conning tower persistently and had her own forward gun put out of action. The U-boat succeeded in adjusting trim and submerged. U-93 appears to have returned to her base on 5th March 1941, with 4 pennants fluttering from her periscope, 24,000 tons claimed. Fourth cruise. U-93 left Lorient for her 4th cruise at the end of April 1941, returning on 16th June. No change in the officers was made. During this period, Court claimed to have sunk 20,000 tons. Since he was awarded the Knight's insignia of the Iron Cross on 3rd June 1941, it seems probable that his success on this cruise was his attack on a convoy which, it was stated, he made in conjunction with U-94, under Captain Lieutenant Herbert Kupich, who was awarded the Knight insignia of the Iron Cross on 25th May 1941. It has not been possible to identify the ships sunk, nor which was the convoy he attacked, but the engine room rating said that it was towards the end of the cruise. One of the ships claimed was said to be a 10,000-ton tanker. At one period of this cruise, U-93, so it was stated, proceeded to a certain square in the vicinity of Greenland to rendezvous with a tanker on a certain day. This U-93 did, but failed to find the tanker, and instead sighted an enemy cruiser and 2 destroyers. She continued to patrol in this area on one engine, and running short of fuel, she requested permission to return to port. This was refused, and 2 days later, U-93 rendezvoused in another area with a tanker, which had just refueled another 500-ton U-boat. After some 34 tons of fuel oil had been taken, a cruiser and 2 destroyers were sighted. The fueling pipe was cut, and the alarm sounded. U-93 submerged and made good her escape, but the engine room rating said the tanker was sunk and 5 of her crew were drowned. He stated that U-93 later on picked up 49 of the tanker's crew and brought them safely back to port. On 16th June 1941, the Deutschlandsender broadcast the return to port of Court's U-boat and stated that his total sinkings amounted to 80,000 tons. It seems that after this cruise, U-93 returned to St. Nazaire. 5th cruise. U-93 left St. Nazaire for her 5th war cruise in July 1941. This was Court's last cruise in command of this boat. The other officers were Oberleutnant Zersee Kapitsky, who had relieved Goetz von Hartmann as first lieutenant, Obersturmmann Barber, Lieutenant zur See Hans Opitz, and Klassen, who remained as engineer officer. Kapitsky wore numerous decorations, and on account of this faiblanterie, the crew compared him with General Goering. He belongs to the 1935 term. He had served in the German Air Force and had distinguished himself during the evacuation of Dunkirk. It was stated that during this cruise, what was believed to be a 25,000-ton troop ship was sighted off Gibraltar, escorted by H.M.S. Renown and a number of other warships. This was in full daylight, and U-93 approached to within 2,000 yards of the convoy. She was, however, detected by one of the escorting destroyers and was attacked with depth charges. No damage was inflicted, but the crew were badly shaken. Early on the following morning, U-93 continued her attack, and, according to the commanding officer, she was within 2,000 yards of a cruiser of the Leander class. On the approach of two destroyers, U-93 immediately submerged and did not surface again until some hours later, only to find herself within 1,000 yards of some destroyers. There was a difference of opinion between Korth and his first lieutenant as to whether they should remain on the surface and attack. It was evidently decided to dive, although the convoy was then only a few thousand yards ahead of the U-boat, with a corvette between her and the convoy. N.I.D. note: H.M.S. Renown and S.S. Pasteur with destroyer escort left Gibraltar on 8th August westbound. No report has been received of any depth charges having been dropped. It is possible, however, that an attack on an ASDIC contact may have been made but not reported on attack of its being considered non-sub. The cruiser to which reference is made may have been Edinburgh or Hermione, which sailed independently from Gibraltar on 8th and 9th August, respectively. It seems probable that the convoy sighted subsequently by U-93 was H.G.70, which sailed from Gibraltar on 9th August. It is known that a number of U-boats made contact with this convoy, and some of them were attacked by escorts. U-93 remained submerged for a long period, and when she surfaced again, the convoy was no longer in sight. On 21st August 1941, U-93 returned to St. Nazaire, and the usual proportion of the crew was sent on leave. None of the 11 torpedoes which were carried on this cruise had been fired. Despite the success hitherto achieved by Korth, his nerves seemed to have been no longer capable of standing the strain of active service in a U-boat, and it is believed that it was for this reason that he was relieved of his command. Many of the crew were also drafted elsewhere, together with Klassen, the engineer officer, who had been in U-93 since she was commissioned. Sixth Cruise. From documentary evidence, it was established that U-93 left St. Nazaire for her sixth war cruise at 0800 on 16th October 1941. 14 torpedoes were carried. The officers consisted of Oberleutnant zur See Horst Elfe in command, Lieutenant zur See Hans Opitz, First Lieutenant, Oberfeinrich zur See Liebe, and Lieutenant Engineer Erich Becker, Engineer Officer. Oberleutnant zur See Kapitsky, formerly First Lieutenant, remained on board as prospective U-boat commander under training. Obersturmmann Barber, who had a high reputation, had been appointed to a commanding officer's training course and was no longer on board. U-93 was unaccompanied by any other U-boat. It was stated that her patrol was off the coast of Newfoundland. No ships appear to have been sunk during this cruise. Opitz is said to have been anxious to fire one of his torpedoes at a light ship off the Newfoundland coast in order to impress the local inhabitants, but Elfe refused to allow him to do this. U-93 returned to St. Nazaire on 20th November 1941, where she remained until she sailed on her final cruise on 23rd December. It was related that on one of her cruises from Lorient, probably during 1940, U-93 was attacked by a British submarine which fired 4 torpedoes at her. She succeeded in avoiding all these. This incident was stated to have occurred just outside the German mine barrage. N.I.D. note: it is impossible to identify this attack from such indefinite information. Section 5. Last Cruise of U-93. The times are German summer time, i.e. 2 hours in advance of Greenwich Mean Time. U-93 sailed from St. Nazaire at 1200 on 23rd December 1941. She had made one trial trip to work up her new crew before setting out. Before leaving on this cruise, she had been in dock for about 14 days, and it was stated by a petty officer that it had been found impossible to repair her after torpedo tube before she sailed. Although the exact nature of the repairs required has not been ascertained, it was said that there were no facilities at St. Nazaire for effecting them, so it was decided to sail with the tube out of action. 2 new torpedo boats of about 1,200 tons displacement and an occasional aircraft escorted U-93 out of harbor. A speed of 10 to 12 knots was maintained. The escort period lasted for 45 hours. No other U-boat accompanied U-93. Some ratings were of the opinion that U-93 had orders to proceed to Genoa on completion of her patrol, but this was not confirmed. When one day out from St. Nazaire, U-93 was forced to dive on account of the presence of German aircraft. One of the engine room ratings kept a short diary of events in which he noted that he returned from leave on 16th December and that during the 3 days, 24th to 26th December, they had proceeded submerged in order that they might celebrate Christmas. On 1st January 1941, he noted that they had seen the new year in, as well as circumstances permitted, that the captain had made a short speech in the control room, and everybody had been given a glass of punch. Nothing seems to have been sighted for some days until one moonlit night U-93 succeeded in making contact with a British convoy and prepared to attack a large merchant ship at a range of 500 yards. During this occasion, she was careful to keep on the less brightly illuminated side of the ship. Just as a torpedo was about to be fired, Horst Elfe ordered hard a starboard, and the attack had to be abandoned. Another ship and the convoy had approached so close to U-93 that she would have been in danger of being rammed had she not put her helm over. It is not clear when this event took place, but it would certainly seem to have been before 9th January 1942, for on or about that date U-93 is said to have been ordered to attack a large homeward-bound convoy which had sailed from Gibraltar. N.I.D. note: this was convoy SL-97G. It was stated that this order had also been passed to U-93 by Focke-Wulf Condor aircraft. It seems probable that U-93 was intended to act as contact keeper, Fühlungshalter, for a group of several U-boats attacking this convoy. the identity of these boats has not been established. U-93 claims to have kept in touch with the convoy for 3 or 4 days before the other U-boats joined her to take part in the attack. It was the general opinion that the convoy consisted of 10 merchant ships escorted by 1 cruiser and 5 destroyers. Section 6. Sinking of U-93. Times are German summer time, i.e., 2 hours in advance of Greenwich Mean Time. U-93 maintained contact with the convoy, and by the evening of 14th January 1942 she had probably been joined by 2 or 3 other U-boats. A petty officer telegraphist stated that at about 01:30 on 15th January, a wireless telegraph message was transmitted to the admiral commanding U-boats at Lorient, and he thought that this had given an enemy destroyer an opportunity to fix U-93's position. It was at about this time that a destroyer was heard on the hydrophones, and it seems that U-93 fired 1 torpedo at periscope depth. No result was achieved, and soon afterwards hydrophone contact was lost. About half an hour later, Elfe decided to surface and close the convoy at utmost speed. As soon as Elfe reached the bridge, a destroyer was sighted on the starboard bow, about 100 yards distant. Visibility was very poor, with some fog prevalent. There was also a considerable westerly swell. At 02:10, soon after U-93 surfaced, H.M.S. Hesperus, acting in conjunction with H.M.S. La Forêt, obtained an radio direction finding contact on U-93, and 1 minute later obtained ASDIC contact. At 02:13, U-93 was sighted and speed was increased from 14 to 25 knots. Fire was opened at 02:16, but this was checked owing to its having a blinding effect on the commanding officer of the H.M.S. Hesperus, and no hits were obtained. At 02:20, the U-boat was fully illuminated by H.M.S. Hesperus searchlight, and 2 minutes later Hesperus rammed her on her port bow. At the same time, dropping a pattern of 5 depth charges set to 50 feet, 1 charge passed right over the conning tower, and another landed on the casing. H.M.S. Hesperus opened fire with 2 of her guns. Hits were obtained, but fire was checked when it was seen that the U-boat's crew were abandoning ship. When U-93 was rammed, the impact threw Elfe and those who were with him on the bridge into the water. The engines were stopped, and many of the instruments were smashed. The remainder of the crew who were below underwent what they described as a most terrifying experience. It seemed that the force of the impact with H.M.S. Hesperus had caused the conning tower hatch to become jammed, so that it was impossible to open it. Some water entered the control room and elsewhere, and the depth gauges had been wrecked, so that the trapped men had no idea how deep they might be. They seemed certain, however, that they were still on the surface, since the water could be heard lapping on the sides of the boat. They worked feverishly to open the conning tower and after hatches. The water had by then reached the batteries, which had been cracked by the effect of the depth charges, and an escape of chlorine was noticeable. Escape apparatus was worn by every man. While these effects at escape were in progress, the boat took a list to starboard and began to sink gradually at the bows. All vents were blown so as to give the boat the best chance of remaining on the surface. At last, after some 20 minutes' labor, the bolts surrounding the conning tower hatch were removed and the hatch was opened. The rest of the crew then assembled in the control room and made their way onto the bridge, whence they leaped into the water and were picked up by H.M.S. Hesperus and H.M.S. Laforet. A bare 2 minutes after the last man had left her, U-93 settled down slowly with a slight list to starboard and disappeared beneath the Atlantic swell. It was stated that no signal was made reporting her fate to the admiral commanding U-boats. It is not known how the 6 members of the crew lost their lives. Some survivors were of the opinion that at least 3 of the men had found it impossible to leave the boat. Others thought that they were drowned whilst waiting to be rescued. The first man to come aboard H.M.S. Hesperus was Horst Helfe, the commanding officer of U-93. Section 7. U-boat losses. U-79. U-79 was sunk in the Mediterranean 20 miles north of Solom on 23 December 1941. She was a 500-ton Type 7C U-boat built at the Vulkanyard Vegesack and commissioned on 13th March 1941. Her commanding officer was Kapitänleutnant Kaufmann, and her first lieutenant was Oberleutnant Zersi Lürsen, both of whom are prisoners of war. The survivors were interrogated in the Middle East and have not been sent to the United Kingdom. U-204. A letter written by Frau Kell from Neustadt in Holstein, dated 6th January 1942, addressed to her husband, whom she imagined might be a prisoner of war in England, indicated that Kapitänleutnant Walter Kell, known to have been in command of U-204, was a casualty. In this letter, Frau Kell writes that she had heard of his recent success, and she hoped that he might have been saved. She added that it would have given her so much pleasure had he been able to make 1 or 2 more cruises. She said in her letter that she had been informed at the end of November that he was overdue. It is probable, therefore, that U-204 was sunk in October 1941. The obituary notice of Walter Kell appeared in the German press on 5th March 1941. He was 27 years old and had been awarded the Iron Cross first and second class. U-452. A letter from Kiel, dated 3rd January 1941, written by a Kapitänleutnant Reinhard Hardigan to Kapitänleutnant Peter Lohmeyer, a prisoner of war from U-651, contained the following statement. Unfortunately, I have to inform you that Jürgen M., the senior officer of our term, has lost his life. Jürgen M. is without doubt Jürgen Marsch, the senior officer of the 1933 term, to which both Hardigan and Lohmeyer belong. Marsch is known to have been in command of U-452. On 2nd October 1941, a letter from Germany stated that Marsch had recently been staying with the Werhofer family in Kiel. On 11th December 1941, a letter from Germany written to a prisoner of war in Canada made inquiries regarding a telegraphist, Kurt Polenz. It was stated that this man was on his first U-boat cruise and had been missing since September 1941. It is known from captured documents that Kurt Polenz commissioned U-452 belonging to the 3rd U-boat Flotilla on 29th May 1941. A Red Cross inquiry of 22nd December 1941 asked whether Petty Officer Telegraphist Ernst Bischoff of U-452 was a prisoner of war. It was stated that he had been missing on 13th September 1941. It seems certain, therefore, that U-452 was lost during August or September 1941. U-579 and U-580. With reference to Confidential Book 405138, pages 11 and 12, in which the loss of 2 unknown U-boats was mentioned, it has now been ascertained from prisoners of war that these 2 boats were U-579 and U-580. U-579, under the command of Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Ratsch, is stated by prisoners to have been rammed and sunk off Memel in November 1941. There were no survivors. U-580, under the command of Kapitänleutnant Coleman, was lost during exercises in the Baltic in November 1941. The commanding officer was among those rescued. 2 unknown U-boats. A. An inquiry from the International Red Cross, Geneva, dated 28th February 1942, asked for information regarding Funk-Obergefreite telegraphist Johannes Rost, stated to have been missing since 1st December 1941, and belonging to a U-boat based on Brest. This man is not a prisoner of war, nor is he a casualty from any U-boat known to have been sunk. B. An inquiry from the International Red Cross, Geneva, dated 28 February 1942, asked for information regarding an engineer officer, Karl Heine, missing with his U-boat since 16th December 1941. It is known that this officer was an engineer sublieutenant in a U-boat flotilla. He is not a prisoner of war. It is possible that he may have been the engineer officer of the U-boat sunk by H.M.S. Nestor on 15th December 1941. There were no survivors. Unknown Italian U-boat. Prisoners stated that an Italian U-boat had recently been sunk by torpedo off St. Nazaire. No confirmation of this report has been obtained. Section 8. U-boats of the 7th U-boat Flotilla. A notebook taken from one of the survivors of U-93 gave information regarding the U-boats belonging to the 7th U-boat Flotilla based on St. Nazaire between April 1941 and January 1942. The following U-boats were mentioned: U-69, U-71, U-73, U-74, U-77, U-85, U-93, U-94, U-95, U-96, U-97, U-98, U-101, U-203, U-206, U-431, U-433, U-552, U-553, U-559, U-567, U-568, U-569, U-575, U-751. The extracts from this notebook have been tabulated and are as follows. Listed in column by boat, date, supplied with torpedoes, electric or air, approximate date of sailing, torpedoes expended, electric or air, torpedoes returned, the date, electric or air, approximate date of return, and remarks, etc. Further information regarding U-boats of the 7th Flotilla obtained from prisoners of war is as follows. U-74. A 500-ton U-boat, type 7B, built at the Volkenjahr Wegesack, was commissioned early in November 1940 under the command of Kapitänleutnant Kentrat. Trials lasted until February 1941. Sometime in February, she left Kiel for St. Nazaire and claims to have sunk 20,000 tons of shipping out of a convoy at night. She is stated to have arrived at St. Nazaire in April 1941, but apart from the fact that 2 torpedoes were returned on 15th April, the dates of her departure from Kiel and her arrival at St. Nazaire have not been confirmed. The officers on board at this time were Oberleutnant Sir C. Schug, First Lieutenant, Lieutenant Sir C. Friedrichs, and Oberleutnant Engineer Weiss. Her second cruise took place in May 1941, and she is stated to have been in the vicinity off the Bismarck, when she picked up 3 survivors and landed them at St. Nazaire on 1st June 1941. During September, U-74 cruised in the South Atlantic and returned to her base on 27th September 1941. She was still in harbor in 17th October 1941. U-94. After her cruise ending in 18th August 1941, Captain Lieutenant Herbert Kuppisch, who had been in command since she was commissioned, was relieved by Oberleutnant Sir C. Otto Itis. It was stated that Kuppisch was suffering from a nervous breakdown and had been given a shore appointment. U-96. On 20th May 1941, a German broadcast announced that a U-boat commanded by Captain Lieutenant Lehmann Willenbrock had sunk 33,000 tons of enemy shipping consisting entirely of tankers in convoy. This success seems to have been achieved at a cost of 8 torpedoes. No information regarding her cruise in August 1941 has been obtained. On 24th October 1941, she left St. Nazaire on another cruise. This patrol ended in the beginning of December 1941 when U-96 returned to St. Nazaire and lay alongside U-93. A story was told of how this boat had experienced serious battery trouble off Gibraltar on the cruise from which she had just returned. On this occasion, an engine room petty officer and 2 stokers were said to have plugged up a number of leaks in the batteries caused by U-96 having crash-dived off Gibraltar during an aircraft attack and struck her bow on the bottom at a depth of 165 meters, or 541.34 feet. For this work, all 3 were decorated with the Iron Cross First Class at a special parade held on their return. The story was related by members of U-93's crew who were detailed for guard duties in U-96 while the ceremony took place. N.I.D. note: this may have been one of 3 attacks by Swordfish aircraft between 30th November and 2nd December 1941. On 20th January 1942, the official German news agency stated that Lehmann Willenbrock had just returned to base after successful operations against British convoys in the North Atlantic. Throughout the cruise, the U-boat was faced with high seas and heavy storms. Due to the weather, Lehmann Willenbrock had had difficulty in keeping his boat at periscope depth. According to a statement he had made when a convoy was spotted, it was found that the ships were bound to steer a fairly straight course on account of the heavy weather. From close range, a torpedo was fired at a 10,000-ton ore steamer sailing in the middle of the convoy. Later, when the U-boat was able to surface, it was established that a direct hit had been obtained. N.I.D. note: this incident cannot be identified. U-203. It is known from documents that U-203, under the command of Captain Lieutenant Rolf Mutzelberg, was supplied with 11 torpedoes at St. Nazaire on 6th July 1941. He probably sailed on the following day. This cruise was described in an interview broadcast by Mutzelberg on 4th August 1941. See Confidential Book 405127 and Confidential Book 405131. He claimed to have sunk 31,000 tons of merchant shipping and a British destroyer. On this cruise, Mutzelberg stated that he had expended all his torpedoes and almost all his fuel. Presumably, U-203 remained in harbor for about 6 weeks, as it is known that she sailed again on 17th September 1941. On 23rd November 1941, Mutzelberg was awarded the Knight Insignia of the Iron Cross. He was reported to have sunk 11 armed merchant ships, totaling 75,000 tons. See Confidential Book 405138. U-206. U-206, under the command of Captain Lieutenant Herbert Opitz, a cousin of Hans Opitz of U-93, was stated to have been at St. Nazaire while U-93 was there. Hans Opitz remembered wishing his cousin good luck as he set out on patrol from this port just before U-93 left on her cruise on 23rd December 1941. According to this information, U-206 had once been shelled by artillery fire from Gibraltar during daylight. N.I.D. note: there is no corresponding report from Gibraltar to confirm this. U-552. On return from the cruise, which lasted from 27th May until 4th July 1941, Captain Lieutenant Erich Topp, in command of U-552, was awarded the Knight Insignia of the Iron Cross after sinking 25,300 tons of enemy shipping, said to have consisted of 16 ships. The announcement of this award was made before Topp reached harbor, and the crew presented him with a wooden replica of the Ritterkreuz, which he wore on entering St. Nazaire harbor. There seems to be some uncertainty regarding the accuracy of the German broadcast. It was announced on 4th July 1941 that Topp had been awarded the Ritterkreuz while he was operating in the North Atlantic. On 1st August 1941, the Deutschlandsender stated Topp had now returned from his latest cruise on which he had sunk 25,300 tons. It is known from the torpedo artificer's notebook that U-552 returned 4 torpedoes at St. Nazaire on 4th July 1941, and that she was supplied with 14 torpedoes on 16th August 1941. Survivors from U-93 stated that U-552, still under the command of Erich Topp, left St. Nazaire shortly after U-93 sailed on 23rd December 1941. U-567. It was stated by prisoners that U-567, Captain Lieutenant Endras, had taken part in the attack on British convoy in December 1941, described in Confidential Book 405138, during which U-751 sank H.M.S. Audacity. It was alleged that U-751 had received no damage, but U-567 had been subjected to attack by 32 depth charges and had sustained considerable damage. A German communique of 31st March 1941 announced that the U-boat under the command of Endras had failed to return from a war cruise and that the entire crew was lost. N.I.D. note: the above attack was probably that made by Deptford and Samphire. Section 9. Other U-boats. U-15. With regard to the loss of U-15 in the Baltic in February 1940, see Confidential Book 405113, it was stated by survivors of U-93 that her pre-war commander, Captain Lieutenant Heinz Buchholz, was still in command at the time, and that Oberleutnant Peter Fram was the first lieutenant. The death of both these officers has been reported. U-43. A communiqué issued by the official German news agency on 14th January 1942 claimed that a U-boat commanded by Kapitänleutnant Wolfgang Lüth had sunk 4 enemy ships totaling 24,000 tons out of a convoy in the Atlantic. Lüth is stated to be still in command of U-43. U-50. A survivor from U-93, who had formerly served in U-52 in the same flotilla as U-50, had been sunk whilst under the command of Kapitänleutnant Grosse. It is believed that U-50 was the U-boat sunk either by H.M.S. Imogen on 27th April 1940 or by H.M.S. Amazon and H.M.S. Witherington on 29th April 1940. On 22nd June 1940, a letter to a prisoner of war stated that Kapitänleutnant G did not return from his U-boat cruise to Norway. U-57. U-57, previously commanded by Kapitänleutnant Klaus Kort, was said to have made at least 9 cruises, during which 35,000 tons of enemy shipping had been sunk by May 1940. The first 4 were made in 1939, but the first success did not come until the 4th cruise, when 2 merchant ships were sunk off the British coast. On her 5th cruise, U-57 sank 1 steamer, on her 6th cruise 1 tanker, and on her 7th 1 tanker and 1 freighter. She was also said to have sunk some shipping on her 8th and 9th cruises. U-57 had a Red Devil as her badge and operated mostly from Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, never from France. Most cruises were said to have lasted 10 to 12 days. The above information derives from a prisoner from U-93 who had previously served in U-57. Another prisoner, who seemed quite well informed about the achievements of this U-boat, said that mines had been laid on 3 of her cruises. U-66. A communiqué of the German High Command, quoted by the official German news agency on 27th January 1941, announced that a U-boat commanded by Kapitänleutnant Zapp had been particularly successful in recent operations off the Canadian coast. It is believed that Kapitänleutnant Zapp is in command of U-66. U-123. On the 24th January 1942, the official German news agency stated that a U-boat under the command of Kapitänleutnant Hardigan had distinguished herself in North American and Canadian waters, having been responsible for the sinking of 8 ships totaling 53,000 tons. Among these ships were the 3 tankers sunk in the near vicinity of New York. Hardigan is stated by prisoners to be in command of U-123, a 750-ton U-boat which he recently took over from Kapitänleutnant Oskar Muhl. U-124. A communiqué of the official German news agency of 14th January 1942 claimed the sinking of the cruiser H.M.S. Dunedin by Kapitänleutnant Joachim Mohr. The victorious U-boat, it was added, returned to a port on the Atlantic coast. Mohr is believed to be in command of U-124, a 750-ton U-boat belonging to the 2nd Flotilla stationed at Lorient, to which port he presumably returned on the above-mentioned occasion. According to the German Transocean News Agency on the following day, Mohr fired a salvo of torpedoes at the cruiser, one of which hit under her bridge, causing her to take such a list that the U-boat crew could see down her funnels. 130. On 13th January 1942, the official German news agency announced that a U-boat commanded by Corvette Captain Kals had especially distinguished herself in attacks on shipping in the North American and Canadian coastal areas. Prisoners believed that Kals was in command of U-130, a 750-ton U-boat of the Second Flotilla. Kals spoke from Radio Luxembourg on 28 February 1942 and said that it was warmer on the American coast than at his own base, and that on return to port he had flown 5 pendants, 4 of which indicated the destruction of tankers. U-564. On 17th January 1942, the Berlin radio broadcast an interview with Oberleutnant Sir C. Reinhard Teddy Sören, stated by survivors from U-556 to be in command of U-564. Standing before the microphone, Sören claimed to have sunk 33 vessels, totaling 204,000 tons, before assuming command of a U-boat. Since receiving command of his own U-boat, this officer said that he had sunk a further 18 ships of various kinds, bringing the totals of his sinkings to between 260,000 and 270,000 tons. Section 10. U-Boat Bases. La Baule and St. Nazaire. La Baule, about 10 miles from St. Nazaire, was stated to be used for the accommodation of the crews of the U-boats forming the 7th Flotilla. Most of the hotels have been commandeered by the German naval authorities, including the Majestic, the Royal, and the Adriana. Headquarters of the 7th Flotilla are said to be in the Adriana Hotel. Captain Lieutenant Soller, the flotilla commander, lives here. The crew were first in the Hotel Majestic, but later moved to the Royal Hotel. There is a bus and tram service between La Baule and St. Nazaire. When a U-boat returns to St. Nazaire from a patrol or cruise, it is customary for 1/3 of the complement to go on leave. 1/3 are sent to La Baule, and the remaining third act as guard and either live on board or in the town of St. Nazaire. The Hotel Hermitage at the La Baule has been converted into a naval and military hospital. It was related that in October 1941 6 bombs had fallen on this building, only one of which had exploded. It was stated that during an air raid on St. Nazaire on 21st December 1941, bombs had fallen close to the U-boat shelters on a supply ship. Lorient. It was stated that at the time of the sinking of U-93 in January 1942, the second U-boat flotilla was still based on Lorient. It was confirmed that the headquarters of the Admiral commanding U-boats, Admiral Karl Dönitz, had been transferred from Paris, and that he was now occupying a chateau standing on the extensive park outside Lorient. He has been promoted to the rank of admiral over the heads of several senior officers in recognition of the success of the U-boats operating off the American coast. It must be some satisfaction to him to read in the British press that the Battle of the Atlantic has worsened. Dakar. An officer captured from U-451 stated that German U-boats were now operating from Dakar. N.I.D. note: there is no corroboration of this report. Section 11. U-boat construction. Hamburg, Blohm and Voss Yard. The following information was obtained from a boatswain's mate who is a native of Hamburg. He has lived there most of his life and obtained an excellent knowledge of the Blohm and Voss yard during the period of construction of his U-boat U-574. General. The Blohm and Voss yards, situated on the south bank of the river Elbe, opposite to the Hamburg suburb of Altona, are the largest in Germany, or in German-occupied territory. They employ over 16,000 hands, many of whom are imported from other European countries. It is estimated that one U-boat a week was being launched from the several slipways during the earlier part of 1941. It was suggested that this rate of construction might be increased. In the plan facing this page, based on aerial photographs of the plant, the various sections of the Blohm and Voss complex and surrounding buildings are marked with numbers for identification purposes. Stages of U-boat construction. There are 3 main stages in the construction of a U-boat at this yard. These may be regarded as A. Cutting and shaping of metal plating and part construction of pressure hull, B. Construction of outer hull, C. Fitting out. A. Cutting and shaping and pressure hull. The necessary steel plates arrive in their raw state from steelworks in the various parts of Germany at the railway siding, 74, and are then cold rolled in the adjoining most southerly portion of the main construction shop, 52. From here, they are transported to the next section of the same shop, 53, at which stage they are electrically cut to the required measurements. After this, they proceed to the next door shop, 54, where they are pressed into the necessary shapes by steam presses. By this time, the thickness of the plates is usually about 15 millimeters, and there often ensues a period of storage until they are required for further manufacture. During this intermediate stage, they are stored in the area marked 51. When the time comes for the already shaped plates to be electrically welded, this process is carried out in a nearby shop, 55, after which they are placed on trolleys and run out to the U-boat dock at the western end of the yard, 59. Pieces of metal other than plates, such as mainframes, angle irons, and pieces of intermediate size are welded in shop, 61. There are 3 principal yards in the Blohm and Voss works. These are numbered 7, 59, and 62 on the plate. Yard number 59 usually takes about 16 U-boats building at a time in 4 rows of 4. Yard number 62 can take about 6 U-boats under construction. Yard number 7 is assumed also to be engaged in U-boat construction. The keel plate of a U-boat is made in one of these yards on a series of trolleys running on rails. The trolleys are secured by means of chocks. After any one U-boat has been launched, the remaining U-boats under construction in the higher portions of each slip are allowed to run down and take the place of their predecessor nearer the river. The construction of the pressure hull itself begins in the northernmost end of the main shop, 56, and it is here that the steel plates from the shop, 55, are built up on the keel. The pressure hull itself is made in 2 portions, a fore and an after section. Each of these, in the case of a 500-ton U-boat, which is the only type of boat built by Blohm and Voss, is about 100 feet long, and its estimated weight is between 75 and 100 tons. After completion in Shop 56, these two portions are moved bodily down to the stocks in any one of the 3 yards by means of wheeled trucks, which remain beneath the hull until the U-boat is launched. Small steam locomotives are used to haul the trolleys carrying the 2 portions of the pressure hull to the stocks designated for them. Here they are welded together, powerful overhead cranes assisting in the process by holding them together until the welding is completed. The conning tower is itself then welded into position, and the stage is set for the building of the outer hull. B. Construction of outer hull. During the whole process of fitting the outer hull onto the pressure hull, many of the larger fittings of the U-boat are moved into position. Bulkheads, main driving shafts, torpedo tubes, propellers, hydroplanes, and rudders. Hydrophones, oil tanks, and the air pressure system are, for instance, installed. In addition, the membranes and external portions of the S-Gerät detector gear are put into place. Electric welding is used throughout, which necessitates work proceeding only by daylight for fear of revealing the position of the yards to enemy aircraft. Work proceeds in this way until the hull of both pressure and outer hulls are completed, except for the engine room hatch, through which the engines are later put into place. The combined hulls are then ready for launching, which is always attended by the dockyard admiral. C. Fitting out. The newly launched U-boat is then towed around to the eastern end of the quay, south of the yards, and here the process of fitting out begins. This is carried out in 9 stages, the U-boat moving successively from berth to berth as each of these is completed. During the first 7 of these stages, the U-boat is camouflaged by an awning fixed to the U-boat itself. After the 7th stage has been passed, however, this is removed, and the camouflage from then on consists of a hinged wooden shelter, which, when not in use, can be folded back to lie on the quay. Stage 1 in the process of fitting out is effected in the position marked 48 on the plan. It is here that the electric wiring system, pipelines, and certain instruments are installed. Stage 2 is the process of fitting the heavy machinery, which is lowered into her by means of a crane, 47. While this is being done, the U-boat generally lies in the position marked 49 on the plan. This machinery includes both the diesel engines and the electric motors, as well as the accumulators. Any guns, torpedo firing control mechanism, or periscopes are simultaneously fitted. Before the diesel engines are fitted into the U-boat, they are always tested continuously for 8 hours in a special shop, 44. But there does not seem to be any similar process of initial testing in the case of the electric motors. The U-boat then passes successively to the 3rd, 4th, and 5th stages of her fitting out process, indicated by positions 50, 67, and 68 in the plan. It is here that the various cables and controls are installed. At the same time, the S-Gerät detector gear, wireless telegraph apparatus, and other instruments are fitted. The hull and superstructure are painted, and much progress is made with the U-boat's interior fittings. At the last of these 3 stages, 68, the stationary engine trials, Standprobe, usually take place. This consists of running the diesel engines continuously for 12 hours, during which period the U-boat is firmly secured to the quay. the propellers turning in opposite directions. After 6 hours have elapsed, the movement of each screw is reversed. During each of these 2 6-hour periods, the speed of the engines is gradually accelerated until full speed is attained, at which velocity they are made to run for at least 1 hour. The final stages in the fitting out process are those of putting the finishing touches to the hull and interior mechanism of the U-boat. This is done at the positions immediately north of where she previously lay, numbered 72 and 73 on the plan. The upper deck is here polished and smoothed off, after which it is painted the same color as the rest of the hull, a grass-green color being used as a foundation. The U-boat is now ready for her first trial trip. On her return from this trial trip, the U-boat ties up at each of the 2 berths marked 1 and 2 on the plan, where any further necessary adjustments are made, together with the finishing touches to her paintwork. The boat is then ready to leave the yard. Procedure after leaving Blohm and Voss yards. Having passed through all the processes enumerated above, the U-boat casts off from berth 1 and proceeds down the Elbe to Brunsbüttel, where she enters the locks of the Kaiser Wilhelm Canal en route to Kiel. On arrival at that port, she is taken over by the U-boat's acceptance commission, U-Bootsabnahmekommission. On this trip she carries no torpedoes nor gun ammunition, nor is she usually degaussed. No ballast has been placed in position, nor are the tanks trimmed. The whole of the journey is made on the surface. The U-boat generally remains at Kiel in the hands of the Acceptance Commission for 6 weeks, during which period the trim is adjusted and diving trials are carried out. Degaussing is also effected, and she then leaves for the Baltic, for the crew to carry out their operational training. The period between delivery by the Acceptance Commission and completing trials is usually some 10 weeks. Output of U-boats. In May 1941, on the last occasion when the prisoner was in Hamburg, there were 22 U-boats on the stocks at Blohm and Voss's yards, in addition to which many were being fitted out at the various dockyard berths. The total of 22 was made up of 16 in the more northerly of the 2 yards west of the shipyard complex, 59, where each of the 4 slipways accommodated 4 boats, one behind the other, and 6 in the more southerly yard, 62, where each of the 3 slipways housed 2 boats. It was also understood at that time that the yard facing the river Elbe, 7, was busy constructing U-boats, but the prisoner had not himself visited this yard. As, however, it was known that Blohm and Voss were not engaged in any sort of construction other than of U-boats, it was assumed that the yards in question were also engaged in U-boat production. Blohm and Voss were so much occupied with the construction of U-boats that they were unable to engage in repair work of any kind other than overhauling and refitting engines in U-boats or surface vessels actually built at their own yards. This took place at the floating dock marked 6 on the plan. It was stated that weekly sailings of newly commissioned boats take place every Thursday, and that the boats leave the Blohm and Voss yards at 10:00. Shipyard staff and works management. In the middle of 1941, some 16,000 workpeople were employed in the Blohm and Voss yards. This total included about 4,000 Dutchmen and a few Italians, none of whom were allowed to work on the actual slipways. They were, however, allowed to board U-boats to carry out minor welding work during the fitting out process. All departments worked a two-shift system, except those working in the open air who only operated in the daytime. Hours of work were as follows: day shift, 0600 to 0900, 0900 to 0930 breakfast, 0930 to 1200, 1200 to 1300 dinner in works canteen, 1300 to 1600. Night shift, 1800 to 2100, 2100 to 2130 break, 2130 to 2400, 2400 to 0100 meal, 0100 to 0400. Work was carried out on 7 days a week, the weekly free day being staggered so as to cause the least disturbance with output. The annual holiday totaled 1 week. All men working in the yards, whether of military age or not, were considered as bound by law to remain at their posts until the end of the war. Communism and other political creeds were latent in many of the workers, but no cases occurred of any free vent being given to these beliefs. In general, work was done conscientiously, the employees being proud of the boats they built and depressed when they heard of one of them being lost. Similarly, U-boat personnel had every confidence in the Blohm and Voss staff and were always glad to man a boat turned out at that yard. Absenteeism took place occasionally, though not to any serious extent. If a valid excuse could not be provided, the offender was taken in charge of the police, the usual punishment being 3 days' imprisonment. Some discontent used to be caused by the alleged inadequacy of the midday meal provided by the firm, for which they were obliged to surrender food coupons. Security and defenses. To landward, the yards are surrounded by a high wall, while the anti-aircraft defenses from an aerial point of view consist of 2 quadruple 20mm flak guns and light flak guns placed in the superstructure of the stocks. There is a work guard of between 600 and 800 men wearing a black uniform with the words Werkschutz, Works Protection, in white letters on a black armlet. They are all ardent Nazis and mostly of less than 30 years of age. As in the case of the remainder of the shipyard personnel, the Werkschutz work in 2 shifts, there being about 300 to 400 men on duty at a time, all armed with revolvers and patrolling both inside and outside the actual building. They man special guard houses opposite each U-boat fitting out. The SS organization is responsible for their maintenance. All shipyard personnel have to be armed with passes to enter the yard area, each pass bearing the owner's work number, name, and signature, but no photograph. The yards have no special air raid warning system of their own, but take their cue from the general raid warning system of the city of Hamburg. Immediately an air raid warning is sounded, the instructions are for every man to down tools and go for the shelters beneath the yard power stations or naval storehouse, which are fitted with gas-proof doors and are reasonably comfortable. U-boat personnel during construction period. The technical members of the crew of each U-boat are drafted to stand by the boat during the constructional period. This is known as the Baubewahrung. The crew are housed in the yard barracks, 30 on plan, and attend frequent lectures and demonstrations on board the depot ship Rhein-Godenwind, 66. Miscellaneous. In October 1941, an auxiliary cruiser thought to be the Casablanca of the Oldenburg Portuguese line, was lying to the position marked 71 on the plan, where she was being fitted out. Guns were being mounted and torpedo tubes were seen on the quayside, apparently awaiting mounting. At the same period, a 22,000-ton liner in course of construction was lying in the position denoted by the figure 38 on the plan. She was as yet unnamed, and no work was proceeding on her. The new Blohm and Voss dry dock, 10, was completed in October 1941. The dock gates are of the sliding type, opening into recesses in the dock wall, and are thought to be electrically operated. To the southwest of the shipyard area are a number of buildings, 34 and 35, which form a detached part of the Blohm and Voss aircraft factory. The plant proper is situated to the northeast of the general area included in the plan. Key to plan of Blohm and Voss yards. 1. Key for 9th stage of U-boat fitting out. 2. Key for 8th stage of U-boat fitting out. 3. Store for small parts in final fitting out. 4. Paint and paraffin store. 5. Workshop and store for materials used in floating docks. 6. 4 floating docks. 7. U-boat building yards. Light flak in stocks. 8. Traveling crane for dry dock. 9. Approximate position of dry dock gates. 10. Dry dock. 11. 4 cranes used for dry dock. 2. Workman's main shelter and clocking in lodge. 13. Office buildings. Quadruple machine guns at west roof. 14. State-owned canteen for Blohm and Voss and Stolken yards. 15. Entrance to Elbe Tunnel. 16. Building destroyed in air raid. 17. Stulken yard engineers shop and store. 18. Stocks of Stulken shipbuilding yard. 19. Stulken yard. 20. Small yards for barge building. 21. Small yards for barge building. 22. Blohm and Voss wood stores. Patterns made here. 23. Premises of a firm of scrap metal merchants. 24. Mess. 25. Severe air raid damage caused here in May 1941. 26. Sulfur factory. 27. Canteen building. 28. Barrack building. 29. Wood store. 30. Barrack buildings for housing U-boat school personnel. 31. Headquarters of Port of Hamburg Municipal Fire Service. 32. Grain elevator. 33. Side entrance to yard used chiefly by naval personnel. 34. Blohm and Voss aircraft factory assembly hangar. 35. Building used for manufacture of aircraft parts. 36. Blohm and Voss engineers shop and store. 37. Wood store. Scrap metal is stored between here and 36. 38. Unfinished 22,000-ton liner. 39. Transformer house. 40. Area for storing. 41. Store for new metal parts. 42. Transporter for stores arriving by barge. 43. Building known as arsenal. It contains linen, rope, crocketry, etc., supplied to U-boats. The main ARP shelter for the whole yard is under this building. 44. Shed for testing diesels before mounting in U-boats. 45. Tool store. 46. Area in which pressure hull sections are stored before joining. 47. Crane. 48. Key for first stage of U-boat fitting out. 49. Key for second stage of U-boat fitting out. 50. Key for third stage of U-boat fitting out. 51. Area for storage of steel plates after delivery from works. 52. Cold rolling of steel plates takes place here. 53. Steel plates cut electrically here. 54. Steel plates bent by steam presses here. 55. Steel plates welded together here. 56. Shop for construction of U-boat pressure hull. 57. Works, fire station, and barracks of Werkschutz. 58. Canteen. 59. U-boat building yard. 60. Jetty for local traffic. 61. Wooden sheds where angle irons and smaller U-boat parts are welded. 62. U-boat building yard. 63. Canteen. 64. Boiler house and power station, dynamos in southwestern portion. 65. 8 oil tanks. 66. U-boat depot ship Hein Gudenwind. 67. Key for 4th stage of U-boat fitting out. 68. Key for 5th stage of U-boat fitting out. 69. 2 cranes. 70. Store for U-boat interior fittings. 71. Berth occupied in October 1941 by Casablanca. 72. Key for 6th stage of U-boat fitting out. 73. Key for 7th stage of U-boat fitting out. 74. Main railway siding. Section 12. Victualling in U-boats. Victualling in U-boats is undoubtedly excellent. The provision of good food inboard U-boats seems to attract into the service who would otherwise be unwilling to volunteer. Many cases are known to exist of men volunteering for U-boats for this and for no other reason. Not only is U-boat food infinitely better than that obtainable in Germany generally, but is also far better than that prevailing in other branches of the German Navy. There would seem to be no restrictions in the amount of food eaten by any man on board a U-boat, and the quantities carried are usually adequate for a 2 months' cruise. Victuals carried may be divided into 2 classes, fresh and preserved. Fresh food usually consists of meat, both sausage and otherwise, vegetables, and eggs. The meat is stored in an ice chest and elsewhere in the boat. This applies also to the vegetables, except for potatoes, which are usually stacked anywhere where room can be found. The tinned food is stored under the diesel engines, beneath the torpedo tubes, and in any unoccupied space available. Hard sausages are hung in the control room and anywhere else where there is sufficient headroom. Bread is generally black rye bread, stored in tins after being wrapped in oil paper and silver paper. This bread is much appreciated by the crew. Butter is stored in tins. During the first part of the cruise, meals usually consist of fresh food, and when green vegetables, fresh meat, and fresh sausage have been consumed, the hard sausage is then eaten, and finally, resort is made to the tinned foods. Potatoes, however, are usually available throughout the whole cruise. Some idea of the daily meals served can be obtained from the following list, which formed the meal chart of U-93 during the period 12th to 18th January 1942. Monday. Breakfast: coffee, bread, dripping. Lunch: lentil and bratwurst, long sausage. Plums. Tea: butter, bread, various kinds of sausage meat. Tuesday. Breakfast: coffee, biscuits, butter, jam. Lunch: soup, pork, potatoes, vegetables. Tea, butter, bread, various sausages. Wednesday. Breakfast: cornflakes, biscuits, butter. Lunch, poached eggs, spinach, potatoes, apricots. Tea, butter, bread, tongue, sausage, cheese. Thursday, breakfast, coffee, bread, butter, jam, cheese. Lunch, sauerkraut, pig's trotters, Eisbein, stewed apples. Friday, breakfast, coffee, butter, bread, eggs. Lunch, soup, goulash, potatoes, peaches. Tea, butter, bread, various sausages. Saturday, breakfast, coffee, butter, bread, jam. Lunch, vermicelli soup, beef pudding. Tea, butter, bread, cold meat. Sunday, breakfast, coffee, bread, eggs, butter. Lunch, pork, cabbage, strawberries, and cream. Tea, butter, ham, bread, sausage. Comparison of the above menus with the typical dishes served in U-70 during the period February to April 1941, see Confidential Book 405118, would seem to indicate that there has been no substantial change in the quality of the food since that date. Section 13. Action between Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and H.M.S. Glorious on 8th June 1940. The following description was obtained from an officer prisoner of war who was serving in the battleship Scharnhorst at the time of her action in company with Gneisenau against His Majesty's ships Glorious, Acast, and Ardent. It was the 8th June 1940, and the waters north of Narvik were dead calm. Of wind there was no suspicion. Both Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had been patrolling the area north of that port and were steaming in company. It was about 1600 German summertime. Suddenly, a senior midshipman aloft reported that he had sighted a wisp of smoke on the horizon, and both German ships altered course toward and increased to full speed. Shortly afterwards, the superstructure of an aircraft carrier could be recognized, which was seen to be escorted by 2 destroyers. All on board the German ships knew the 3 vessels sighted must be hostile, but fire was withheld until closer range was established. As one of the destroyers approached Scharnhorst, she signaled the battleship by searchlight, which indicated that the German ships had not been recognized. Their reply was to open fire on H.M.S. Glorious with their 28-centimeter guns. Scharnhorst's first salvo burst on the aircraft carrier's deck, and flames were seen to appear. Only 3 or 4 of Glorious's aircraft were on deck at the time, and none of them took off. Several more salvos struck the Glorious, who seemed unable to return the fire. After some 3 or 4 hits had been registered on her, she burst into flames in several places, and the 2 destroyers formed a smoke screen around her. The few salvos fired by Glorious did not hit either of the German ships, which the German officer considered hardly surprising in view of the longer range possessed by the German guns. Although Glorious was now in flames from stem to stern, she continued on her course at a speed which surprised the Germans, who were still more amazed at the courageous manner in which the 2 destroyers Acasta and Ardent stood by her to the last. It was known full well on board the German ships that with their superior speed the British destroyers could easily have escaped the battleships, and the fact that they remained to cover the aircraft carrier with smoke screens and then to engage the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, thus courting certain destruction, drew expressions of deep admiration from their opponents. After about 3/4 of an hour, Glorious sank in a cloud of smoke and flame, and the battleships then turned their attentions exclusively to the 2 destroyers. These they attacked with their 15-centimeter guns, the destroyers replying fiercely. Several of their shells struck both German ships, but could inflict little damage on the heavy armament of the battleships. More effective, however, was a torpedo which struck Scharnhorst on her starboard side aft, putting her starboard propeller out of action, and at the same time damaging the after turret and killing some 50 of her crew. This very valiant engagement on the part of Acasta and Ardent continued for about 1 hour, after which both destroyers were sunk. It was stated by the officer prisoner of war that the German ships cruised around for some time searching for survivors, but none were found. It was not until the next day that it became known that a German aircraft had sighted and picked up 2 ratings from Glorious. The same morning, the German cruiser Admiral Hippe had sunk the British armed merchant cruiser Orama and the tanker Oil Pioneer. A hospital ship which was believed to have been accompanying the 2 British ships escaped. After this action against Glorious and her escort, both Scharnhorst and Gneisenau put into Trondheim. On the following day, these ships were attacked by British Skua aircraft, which scored a hit on the Scharnhorst in the center of her main deck, just abaft the 15-centimeter gun. It was claimed, however, that this bomb failed to explode. A fortnight later, Scharnhorst left Trondheim for Kiel. She had a somewhat eventful journey, not only by reason of her damaged condition, but also on account of persistent attacks by British aircraft. As a result of the torpedo hit she had received in the action with the 2 British destroyers, her speed was reduced to 22 knots. She managed, however, to reach Kiel by using her center and port shafts. It was stated that the Scharnhorst was attacked with bombs and torpedoes during her passage to Kiel, but no hits were scored, though some fell unpleasantly close. Attacks were made on her about every 20 minutes for a couple of hours, both by torpedo-carrying aircraft and bombers. The damage inflicted during the action of 8th June and whilst in Trondheim necessitated repairs which occupied 4 months. It was denied that any damage had been caused by air attacks during this period. The senior midshipman who originally reported the sighting of Glorious was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class. The commanding officer of Scharnhorst was Captain Zersee Kurt Hoffmann, who was stated to be still in command. He is described as a gunnery expert, having a very good knowledge of British gunnery technique. The following supplementary information was obtained from a German Air Force NCO, who was telegraphist in the aircraft which first sighted H.M.S. Glorious. The attack which Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were able to launch on H.M.S. Glorious was largely facilitated by Glorious having been sighted on the previous day by a Heinkel 115 with a crew of 3 operating from Trondheim. The aircraft was on patrol on that day in the area concerned, manned by a pilot, an observer, and 1 telegraphist. The observer who first sighted Glorious was formerly a naval officer familiar with the appearance of British men of war. The telegraphist attempted to establish contact with his base at Trondheim in accordance with the regulations, but, owing to what he described as bad weather conditions, failed to do so. In view of the importance of this report, however, he felt justified in breaking all rules and informing Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, who were known to be in the vicinity. This he accordingly proceeded to do, adding at the same time this aircraft's lettering and recognition signals. At the time of her sighting, Glorious was some 5 or 6 miles distant from the aircraft, but her superstructure was plainly recognizable. The machine immediately dived to a height only just above the sea's surface so as to lessen her chances of detection, and made for home. Visibility on the day in question was about 6 miles. As far as the informant was aware, both German battleships sent out their own reconnaissance aircraft on being informed of the presence of the aircraft carrier. Final interception of Glorious occurred the following day. When asked to explain how it was that he was able to establish direct wireless contact with the German ships, the prisoner replied that he had happened to know the special secret wavelength arranged for this communication. He had had access to the safe where the code was kept and had studied it thoroughly, both for the purpose of improving his chances of promotion and because he thought he might find it useful if he were shot down at sea and had to establish contact with German ships. He emphasized the fact that the pilot of his craft refused to take the responsibility for sending the message to Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and left it to the prisoner's discretion to do so. Prisoner was in fact reprimanded on return to his unit for having broken WT silence, but this appears to have been in the nature of a formality, since he was very soon rewarded for his initiative by being promoted direct from aircraftman to petty officer, thus becoming at the age of 19 what he believes was the youngest NCO in the German Air Force. Section 14. German Political Training Establishments. Adensbergen. All German Adensbergen political training establishments were closed down shortly after the outbreak of war. This was due to the fact that all the personnel were almost immediately called to the colors, an event which was considered hardly surprising in view of the age of the men concerned. There were 3 Adensbergen in Germany, one near Stettin, one close to Aachen, and a third at Kempten, not far from Freiburg in Bavaria. The average complement of each establishment was 700 men, making a total undergoing training at any one time of some 2,100. Though thinly veiled to resemble a purely educational center, the purpose of each Adensberg was unquestionably of a political character. The main objective of the course was to inculcate the idea of leadership, Führersprinzip, into a chosen company of younger men. By so doing, the Nazi regime hoped to strengthen its position in such a way that would always leave at its disposal a sufficient number of fully trained personnel to take over the reins of leadership as each older official retired. After the course was over, it was the task of each trainee to return to his district and inculcate to the best of his ability the principles of Nazism into the minds of his flock. Inclusion in an Adensberg took place following an invitation to become a member from the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, the German labor organization. The organization with financial and managerial control of the Adensberg system. Dr. Robert Ley, after whom the Kraft Deutsche Freude Strength Through Joy ship, now used as a U-boat school base at Pillau, was named, was the Nazi personality heading this movement. The usual age at which entry into an Ordensburg took place was at any time between 24 and 30. Older persons were not barred, but it would not be usual for a man younger than 20 to enter, since he had to show that he already had a profession before entering. When a man accepted the invitation to enter an Ordensburg, the Deutsche Arbeitsfront undertook the responsibility of ensuring that any fixed charges payable by him, including the support of dependents, were fully met during his absence. Actual cash payments to the residents were, however, limited to pocket money of Reichsmarks, 1 a day, which were usually spent on such things as beer and occasional visits to the amenities of the local town. A typical day in an Ordensburg began at 0600, in winter at 0700, when men were called and a light breakfast was served. This was followed by 2 hours devoted to some form of game or physical exercise, with the rest of the morning spent in class study. Luncheon was times for 1300, after which at least 4 more hours of exercise were compulsory. The rest of the day was free for going out of the camp or for private affairs. Among the sports and exercises followed physical training, boxing, swimming, horse riding, football, handball, and all forms of athletics figured prominently. Much time was devoted to the study of history, with special emphasis laid on the development of the British and French empires. Students were constantly reminded that Germany had no such empire, and it was their duty to create something similar for their fatherland. The period spent in the Ordensburg varied according to the appointment for which each man was ultimately intended. In many cases, it was as long as 2 or 3 years, sometimes split up into several periods of some months at a time. Every man on joining became entitled to call himself an Ordensjunker, and the number of men who included this title on their visiting cards is eloquent testimony to the esteem in which it is held. The general layout of an Ordensburg was similar to that of a military camp. The men were accommodated in wooden huts. Each hut housed some 15 men, each of whom had his sleeping quarters in his own cubicle. Uniforms were of a color similar to British khaki, with darker shoulder straps fringed with yellow. The Ordensburgen were designed as a continuation course for the study of political subjects taught in the Adolf Hitler schools and Napoli, Nationalpolitische Erziehungsanstalten, or National Political Educational Establishments. Section 15. Passage of U-boats north of Iceland. With reference to Confidential Book 405132, page 7, in which it was reported that prisoners stated that U-111 on her first cruise in May 1941 proceeded north of the Faroes and Iceland, further interrogation has established the fact that this is incorrect and that U-111 did not pass north of Iceland into the Denmark Strait. It is not known for certain whether this U-boat passed between the Shetlands and Faroes, or between Faroes and Iceland, though the latter is thought more probable. Appendix: List of crew of U-93, survivors, etc. Officers 5, chief and petty officers 12, men 23, total 40. Casualties: officers 1, chief and petty officers 3, men 2, total 6. Total crew: officers 6, chief and petty officers 15, men 23, total 46.